Welcome to the Daily Apple. I'm your host, Kevin White. My occasional co-host, Emma Ryan, and I will dive into all topics related to the science of longevity, along with some other subjects we just find of interest, with the hopes to provide useful information for everyone. This stems from my personal interest to optimize the human condition. To not just live longer, but to live better. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Daily Apple, and I'm really kind of jazzed about sitting down with this guy, Dr. Jeff Durmer, who is really an authority on sleep. He's an MD, PhD. He's worked with tech companies. He's worked with Olympians, high-end performers, and we're going to talk about all that. We're going to talk about sleep, where his interest in sleep started, overview what healthy sleep looks like, why we should care, and just really dive into all that. So I knew when talking to him the first time, I'm like, this is the guy I've been looking for a long time to talk about sleep. So I'm pretty jazzed about this, and I appreciate you making time, Jeff.
It's my pleasure to be here, Kev. Thanks for having me. Yeah. Anytime I get to talk about sleep, I'm happy.
Yeah. Dr. Jeffrey Durmer, tell me about yourself a little bit.
Yeah.
Kind of where you came from, where you trained at, how the heck you got interested in sleep, and where that all originated.
There's not a lot of people in the sleep world, first of all, so it is sort of a unique subset, let's say. So I am originally from the East Coast of the U.S., so New Jersey, Philadelphia area, and I went to Penn in Philly for my medical school training and my PhD training in systems neuroscience. And so my interest in sleep really came out of the science side. As a medical student, we got almost no teaching around sleep itself. So I was exposed to sleep science as a PhD graduate student at Penn. And I found that actually where I was working, and I had a lab where we investigated subconscious vision. So basically preconscious vision, part of the subcortical visual systems of animals. And we were defining a whole pathway within the brainstem that was associated with what we call blind sight now in humans, but we could do the same thing with animals, actually. And the blind sight really was about a part of the brain that became disinhibited or allowed all of a sudden the input from the blind visual field to get to cortex, to consciousness. And that part of the brainstem, actually, we were manipulating was an area called the pedunculopontine nucleus, or PPN. And that little nucleus, unbeknownst to me, working in the visual science part of neuroscience, was also where REM sleep comes from. And so there was a lab working at the vet school at Penn, where I was in the medical school, that was investigating the same nucleus at night as a part of what's called REM behavior disorder, or REM without atonia. It's like acting out dreams. And they have animal models of this. And that laboratory was basically doing the same kinds of manipulations that I was doing in the daytime for visual processing, at night for REM processing. And so I learned, basically from my own PhD thesis, that there's this whole other side, this nighttime activity of the pedunculopontine nucleus. And that led me to think much more about how are we not being taught this in medical school? How am I not learning this? Get to learn subcortical visual processing. It's kind of interesting. And then after my finishing medical school internship and my neurology residency at Penn, I decided to do a fellowship where I could investigate much more in detail the human consequences of sleep deprivation of consciousness itself. And so I did that with the clinical side of sleep medicine and pediatrics and adults, and discovered this entire world that was unbeknownst to me, an incredibly underserved group of people out there in the clinical world who are not even getting any of the basic services associated with sleep health or sleep healthcare, largely because there weren't a lot of people trained. So it just became obvious to me that as an MD PhD, this is a great world to be in, because the basic science, we knew a heck of a lot about the neuroscience behind sleep and circadian rhythms, and learning constantly after the decade of the brain in the 90s, but we weren't translating it into clinical care. So that's where MD PhDs love to live. Put one foot into the lab, one foot into the clinic, and be able to translate as much as possible. And what I found doing research in the sleep world, actually, I moved to Emory after my postdoc and my fellowship, and ran the Emory Sleep Laboratory in adults and peds, because I worked both at CHOP at Philly and HUP, the Hospital for Hospital University of Pennsylvania. Basically ran the pediatric program and discovered an even more underserved population, more so than adults and kids, especially teenagers and the preteens. That's the population at CDC, National Sleep Foundation, all the NIH studies have indicated is the most sleep deprived group within our culture. And it's largely because their circadian rhythms have changed. School start times don't match their sleep time. And then they have after school activities. So kids in that age group are significantly impacted by the surround and their own circadian rhythms. And then it continues into adulthoods. Once you learn behaviors as a kid, that it's okay to give up sleep and that's expected of me.
Yeah.
Then you get into the workforce. It becomes sort of like a badge of honor that you do this. And that was culturally what I was fighting in like the 2000s, 2010, in that era. Now we know a lot more about sleep, and largely because of technology. The technology people wear tell them much more about their sleep. And it's really raised the issue in discussion within the longevity community, within the high performance community, but now trickling down out of those elite groups of people who want to improve and optimize into just folks who want to be healthy, and realizing, hey, this is going to affect my cardiometabolic state. I need to sleep if I want to maintain a good weight, if I want cardiovascular health. I don't want to have dementia as I get older. Sleep is the modifiable risk factor you can actually change more so than anything else to improve that risk profile. So I got involved because it had so many facets, from the public health side all the way to the basic science. And I just found it to be a great area over the course of the last 25 years to really move from basic science, like where I started, into clinical science, and then into technology development and bringing in programming that's evidence-based for individuals coming at with different issues or different ideas about their sleep.
Yeah.
So for me, it's just a very broad area of medicine that is, I feel like I'm sort of standing in the middle of Wyoming looking for another sleep doctor. There's nobody else there. It's just me and like a couple other people I know. We all know each other. Yeah. We all know. We go to the big sleep meeting. There's, every year there's a sleep meeting. This year it's in Seattle. And our biggest meeting is like maybe 2,000 people.
Really?
Something around. Yeah. So it's a small community. There's only something like 2,000 sleep doctors in the United States working right now. So that's a very small number. Yeah. If you think about it.
Yeah. And you mentioned there's no training. I don't remember squat learning. I went to med school in the late 90s, graduated in 2000 and nothing. And you're absolutely right. That was kind of just a badge of honor to, buck up and you're up all night and all that kind of stuff. Of course, some of those things have changed, but now being where you are, is there any training at all is that included at all in medical schools now?
Yeah. So even the places like Emory and Penn, which are some of the leaders within the sleep science world. Some of the best sleep science comes out of a handful of places: Stanford, University of Michigan, some of the Texas universities, Harvard, Penn, and places like Emory. That's not a lot of schools. Even in those schools, I was teaching neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, and clinical sleep-based medical care. I'd had 2 hours of their entire 4 years to teach about the basic science and also teach about the clinical care. There's no way in an hour lecture I can give you all of the background you need to understand the central nervous system's state change, and then another hour to teach you about sleep disorders. When we didn't even, now it may be up to 3 hours from when I was teaching, but still the average is under 4 hours in all medical schools in terms of the amount of time you're actually taught about sleep. Now, that's not a criticism of our healthcare system necessarily. It's more of what the system is designed to do. The system is designed to treat diseases. Yeah. And we have a very disease-ridden population. There's a lot of chronic diseases out there. And because we have so much chronic disease, if we're not focused on that, like the disease itself, we're going to miss the opportunity to really help people who are on fire, having real health issues.
Yeah.
But the bigger problem is that means it leaves little time for prevention. And that's an issue that a lot of us in the sleep world, we look at sleep health and sleep medical care as preventive. Because you're not going to die overnight of restless leg syndrome or sleep apnea.
Right.
But 10 to 20 years of it,
you will.
It will damage you and create potentially, increase your risk for stroke, increase your risk for a heart attack, diabetes, weight gain, all kinds of things, metabolic syndrome, well understood associations. And again, some of these are mechanistic, not just, associations by statistics. So,
I mean, you're answering all my questions that I have listed here before I even get them. I mean, obviously why it's important. You just said that. And one of the big things, I mean, you just alluded to everything really, and it's really all cause mortality. It's going to contribute to all those things. But, dementia is one thing that's really super concerning for a lot of our clients. And we start looking into sleep initially with their first visit because that uncovers so much else.
Totally.
But you're right. One of the biggest concerns is early cognitive decline that people want to do everything they can to avoid, especially if they're ApoE4 carriers or if they, have that family risk factors and all that stuff. So,
I mean, if you look at all the research up to this point, and also not just in the dementia realm, or not just in sort of looking at what does deep non-REM sleep do, or what are the different state changes do within the brain. And there's definitely major advances in understanding like the glymphatic system that takes metabolites out of the brain like the lymphatic system does in the body throughout the night. And it's really active or more active in the deepest stages of parasympathetic tone, which is the deeper stages of non-REM sleep. That's one thing. But there's also all kinds of research associated with inflammation. And we know that the dementia story and even neurodegenerative diseases story is not told from just one angle. Certainly there are genetics, so there's ApoE alleles, there are a number of things that put you at risk. But what is it that creates the nidus of the beginning of dementia? And there are different theories on that. One, and they're supported, and they may all be correct. It's just a matter of collecting enough problems on different sides. And one is glymphatics, like we mentioned earlier, just getting metabolites out of the brain because they can become neurotoxic and cause plaques and tangles potentially. But even more so, it's the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier really excluding things that shouldn't get into the brain. It's very selective and highly, in a sense, monitored by glial cells that don't allow stuff to get into the brain or out, depending on the way things go. That's another issue, that when there's inflammation, the blood-brain barrier doesn't work as well. And blood vessels themselves being inflamed in the brain may be another cause, because there are a lot of studies showing right around an artery, that's where the plaques and tangles begin. That's another component of the beginning of dementias. So removing toxins, yes. Blood flow to the brain, also yes. And the inflammatory process that associates with the development of dementia-like changes in the brain is pretty clear as well. So those are at least two areas where sleep itself has a significant impact, because when you go to bed at night, not only do you go through the glymphatic drainage thing, but you also make anti-inflammatory hormones.
Right.
That's what sleep is naturally associated with. It's really reactive to the pro-inflammation that occurs during the day. Smack your arm, get an increase in things like tumor necrosis factor, IL, all that will occur. And the reason it comes back down is when you go to sleep, you start to make anti-inflammatory cytokines and interleukins that actually calm down those inflammatory pathways. And one of the things that, if you wake up just teleologically after beating yourself into something, you'll feel better. And it feels better because you went through your own natural anti-inflammatory process at night. Yeah. Your brain's doing that on a day-to-day, repackaging neurochemicals, taking out toxins, improving blood flow to the brain. So things that improve oxygenation of the brain and bring more blood flow to the brain help the brain. And that's what sleep does. Sleep is actually about resetting that. Just like we reset insulin receptors and sensitivity at night, we do the same thing within the nervous system. So sleep is an incredibly critical component that contributes to the health of the brain. And when your sleep is not healthy, it reflects in other organ systems becoming unhealthy, like the brain or the heart, kidneys, liver. These all become systemically vascularly inflamed, which is something that we talk a lot about in sleep medicine, is that vascular inflammation, low level LFTs being slightly elevated, thyroid being slightly out of balance, as well as even pancreatic enzymes, amylase, lipase. You can see all of these subtle changes, and it's sort of like, it's a little high, but it's still on the normal end of high. Yeah, but look at the SED rate, the CRP, IL-6. Look at it, they're all elevated. Why? Because the person's pro-inflammatory, and they may even be overweight. And that's another, we know as, we look at obesity and weight gain as actually a pro-inflammatory process. That's another thing that we see associated with sleep disorders. So it becomes a vicious cycle versus a virtuous cycle, which is what we start with the sleep to unwind the vicious cycle so that we can start to make organ systems healthier. And eventually the risk factors go down for all kinds of metabolic and cardiovascular and neurologic issues, which then reflect themselves in things like better mental health. Well known. I mean, just don't sleep real well for a night. You're going to wake up cranky and depressed.
Yeah.
That's just a normal thing. And that's why people drink coffee. Yeah. That adenosine antagonist that we all have in our kitchens.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We're going to get into that for sure. But, I never knew that I knew it created anti-inflammatory hormones, but that's a good point that it leads to, and I assume you see this, people who have, years of bad impaired sleep have an impaired blood-brain barrier, which is really key whenever you talk about dementia. So it's really a multifaceted kind of thing.
Yeah, the immune system itself is not in balance when people's sleep is disturbed. And there's evidence to, I can find an article and anything to basically support my argument. That's something, you know that, right? So I hate that.
Yeah, I know.
So the preponderance of evidence, let's say not just one or two articles, has for many, many years in well-controlled sleep deprivation protocols done in laboratories like the ones at Penn that I worked in. Those studies show convincingly that even a single night of sleep deprivation or partial sleep deprivation for a few days, like sleeping just 6 or 5 hours for 3 or 4 days, has amazing changes in the immune system. Your immune system is very dynamic and it will react very quickly. So you start making pro-inflammatory response, sort of like sympathetic nervous system becomes activated and charged. That drives immune system to also do things that the sympathetic fight or flight response would also be enhanced by. So there's a lot of downstream effects of this. When you get into the real world, the data is a little less certain than these well-controlled studies, but it shows the same kind of signals especially within populations like sleep apnea populations, RLS, and insomnia populations. If you look at those 3 very well-known sleep disordered populations, sometimes overlapping, much higher risk factors for inflammation, and you see cardiovascular disease, strokes, all kinds of downstream effects that are much, much higher. Even just accidents of all kinds, people having accidents in cars, walking across the street, getting hit, accidents because of awareness, mental acuity. These are even short-term effects that are dangerous on a night-to-night basis for people. Yeah. And I've worked with people like truck drivers and airline pilots as part of a lot of the research and also the programming that I've developed with our technology companies. And it's amazing to see how much in some areas, like FAA-based rules, and I worked with the FAA developing those rules, and I'm the FAA's sleep medical experts, so they come asking me questions all the time. But that group is very much associated with like the Air Force, the military. A lot of the guys there are disciplined. And because of that discipline, when you put in place rules and changes and they have good reasoning, they adopt them and they go hard to really benefit from them. Really? Versus other populations, like a lot of the 3 million truck drivers out there, they would definitely do well with better regulations. The problem is in their industry, it's not run the same way as airlines are, which are much more structured and disciplined. It's really dependent on the shipper, like sitting outside of Walmart for like 7 hours waiting to be able to drop your stuff off, and you can't sleep. So it's not up to the truck drivers or their unions or anybody who's trying to take care of them. It's really others that have the effect. So industries are another whole area, and just different public health issues that we have even on the roads with large numbers of people who have sleep disorders that are undiagnosed. That's another thing we know within truck drivers. About a third of them have sleep disordered breathing, which is incredibly high. But who's taking care of those guys? That's the thing.
Like you said, you've worked with the FAA, or you probably still do, but they have protocols in place that are pretty regimented to make sure everybody's on the up and up. And that's good to know.
And FMCSA does as well for the drivers on the road. But it's the actual business pressures that really the drivers suffer. And the amount of chronic disease within truck drivers is so much higher. And a lot of these guys are really trying hard to work out on the road, to eat well, but they go to a truck stop and it's fried chicken and pizza. So they're basically cooking in their cabs now. That's so for these guys, it's really finding ways around the system. So
well, I mean, so the next thing I wanted to get into, because later I'm going to get into some sleep disorders, how we screw everything up. And then some diagnostics, and we'll talk about wearables. But before I get into all that, and then I'm going to talk about a perfect day and how to really optimize your sleep, and then of course get into what Jeff does on a regular basis because you're the example. But the overview kind of, and I know this is a loaded question. This is kind of like, now that I'm thinking about it, it's like asking an astronaut, so hey, how do you fly a rocket? Just take me through that real quick in 3 minutes. But I mean, what does normal sleep look like, and kind of this stage is what happens during sleep, which you've already alluded to, and then the effects of good sleep, how growth hormone is and the different players in that process with hormones.
Yes, the first thing to know about sleep is that it is dynamic, and it is something that gives you back what you need for that given day or that given point in time in your life. So across the life cycle, sleep changes dramatically from infants, as we all know, sleep all day, 12 to 16 hours versus a 3-year-old who is now napping and has, established a circadian pattern of sleep in the night and in the day, to the consolidation of like a kid going to elementary school who sleeps at night and they go to bed early, wake up early. And then as you get into the adolescent period, there's this huge change in circadian rhythm. So kids get sleepier much later, as late as like even 11 or 12. And they really need to sleep more than most others. So they probably need to wake up at 9 or 10 in many cases. So sleep itself is very dynamic. It changes. And then in the 20s and 30s, and as you get older, you kind of establish a pattern that we call the 7 to 9 hour window for sleep. So if we talk about it from that perspective, normal quote unquote sleep is really dependent on what you're experiencing in the daytime and where you are in your life. An athlete in college, for instance, the need for most of us at that age is around 8 to 9 hours of sleep. That's the need that we have in terms of duration. Most athletes don't get that much because they're up early working out. They have classes, they have afternoon workouts, then they have to do projects and stuff and stay up to get those done. So then what would be normal for a kid who's an athlete in college sometimes includes a nap. So putting a nap in the middle of the day to make up the duration issue is part of that. But then as you get into the adult ages, most of the studies demonstrate that people go to sleep around 10 to 10:30. That's sort of an average across the population of adults. And then you wake around 6 to 7 a.m. is sort of like the average wake up time. So 8 hours of sleep is sort of the average for most, or what is predicted to be the average based on a large number of epidemiologic studies.
Yeah.
The problem, though, is that duration is only one dimension of sleep. There are at least two others. One of them is timing. The timing of your sleep, as I mentioned, as it changes across your life cycle, but then also weekday to weekend. So things like we call social jet lag, which is far more prevalent and probably much more pervasive and impactful than we give it credit, because younger people do a lot more of that. They'll go out, stay up late on the weekends with their friends, socialize, and then on the weekdays, they suffer kind of catching up. That happens and continues into adulthood oftentimes, and it's considered normal, but actually it's not. Your brain and body need regularity. That's how sleep itself generates the benefits that you need on a night-to-night basis. And then the third one is quality. Sleep quality is a little bit more it's a little more esoteric in a sense that it's hard to put your finger on what quality is. You know it when you see it, and you know it when you wake up and you feel good. But quality itself can be actually impacted by duration and timing. So quality can also be impacted by medical conditions, what you did the day before, drinking alcohol, THC, what else, you did a hard workout, or even related to being ill, getting sick, getting ill. So there are a lot of things that can affect sleep quality. And then there's sleep disorders themselves, which is another topic. So I look at duration, timing, and quality as the three components of the underlying issue of normal sleep. So 7 to 9 hours is the duration requirement that most of us have. The more exercise and athletics you do, the more sleep you need. And there's a lot associated with metabolic equivalents. You use ATP when you work out. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the phosphates come off. Adenosine actually becomes free. Free adenosine activates a part of the number of different areas in the brain, but one in particular called the ventrolateral preoptic area that actually triggers sleep. So accumulation of adenosine across the day is one of the triggers for sleep, which is also why caffeine is a great potent anti-sleep medicine, because adenosine antagonists or block the effect of adenosine in the central nervous system. So it's much more effective in the morning because you have a little adenosine hanging around after you wake up, so you can get rid of it quicker. Then later at night, actually, it doesn't create as much benefit. But that's sort of one of the reasons that athletes need, or anybody who's exercising will need, a little more sleep than the normal 7 to 9 hours. The timing, as I mentioned earlier, regularity is the key. And then quality itself, measuring that is kind of what a lot of people do with their technology these days, looking to see, hey, why my sleep quality score went down. But there are a number of things that affect quality itself. The things that you can control are duration and timing on a day-to-day basis. And if you can control those dynamically, that can actually improve your sleep quality itself. If your sleep quality, you still don't feel good after waking up after 7 to 9 hours on a regular schedule, that's where professionals come in that can help and actually figure out what your quality issue is. Normally, when you go through cycles of sleep, and we use the term cycles of sleep because the tool that we typically have used in sleep medicine is the polysomnogram. It was developed at Stanford way back in the 1970s as a clinical tool. Before that, it was a research tool. University of Chicago was sort of one of the places that kind of first studied sleep with EEG, and these famous researchers, Kleitman and Aronofsky, that basically developed the understanding about REM sleep and studying kids in the 90s and 40s, and that led to the clinical specialty in the 70s. But PSG testing done in laboratories, basically, sometimes at home nowadays, and that PSG testing itself was just an electrophysiological way to look at state change. And so we made these observations of electrical field potentials that told us that during the beginning of sleep, it looks like this. And as you go into other stages or later into sleep, it looked different. So the EEG waves would slow down, muscle tone would come down, even things like eye movements would change. They'd get these oscillating, dissociative eye movements. And then going into other phases, suddenly you start seeing these rapid eye movements. And that was one of the defining features of a different state that was then called rapid eye movement sleep.
Right.
It turns out if we study that further, you can see the pedunculopontine nucleus, that one nucleus that I was first introduced to in the cat labs. That's actually generating a lot of other downstream effects, not just dreaming and eye movements, but also inhibition of the body. Glycinergic inhibition of the spinal cord causes you to not be able to move during REM sleep. Some people actually experience paralysis and sleep paralysis during those transitions. But REM sleep comes and goes every 90 to 120 minutes normally. It's something that usually is a little shorter in the beginning of the sleep period. And as you go through your sleep, you get longer and longer bouts of REM towards the morning hours. So the vast majority of your REM is actually towards the morning hours when you wake up in the later stages of sleep. In the beginning, you're getting much more non-REM and that deeper non-REM stages, which is much more parasympathetically driven. REM is more sympathetic, parasympathetic. Deep non-REM is all parasympathetic. And to get into that stage early in your sleep period is actually very useful for our biology, because even if you only got 4 or 5 hours of sleep, you at least got that deep non-REM sleep. You got that on a night-to-night basis. In fact, if you sleep deprive a human, they reflexively will go into deep stages of non-REM sleep in recovery. So
Mm.
the recovery sleep becomes very deep and parasympathetically driven, with REM coming on later. So typically 3 to 5 or 6 REM, non-REM bouts going through 90 to 120 minutes through the night. And then in those different stages, different things happen. Like I mentioned, in the deep stages of non-REM sleep, glycinergic or REM sleep, glycinergic inhibition of the body.
Yeah.
A lot of changes in the brain occur associated with dreaming that also involve areas of the limbic system, which creates a whole bunch of memories. And they're oftentimes emotional based memories and fear based memories that are being consolidated in the limbic system, associated with actually activating the hippocampus. And areas of the hippocampus, if you study humans and also in animals, you can see patterns of neural activation in the CA1 and CA3 regions of the hippocampus. And if you look at in the daytime when someone's learning something, the hippocampus does the same thing.
Yeah.
And in fact, the rhythmic or pattern of activation in the daytime is actually activated just the same in the middle of the night in REM. So REM is, in a sense, a way of consolidating memory. At least that's one of the functions we believe REM has, based on the electrical activation of the hippocampus, which we know to be the area of the brain that's important for laying down new memories. So those kinds of studies have been really interesting because we learned that REM.
So there's part of the brain that's working the exact same way as whenever you're learning something. Exactly. I remember thinking, like in med school and stuff, working out problems and working out issues in my sleep. It was, wild, but so
you can do it in REM and non-REM, just the same. So I have a good buddy of mine, Jeff Ellenbogen, who was at Harvard for a number of years. Now I think is at Hopkins now. Jeff's work was looking at non-REM as you're transitioning into sleep, that very lighter stages of non-REM sleep going into the deeper stages. That he actually looking at people doing Tetris, the Tetris kind of game. People who were learning Tetris for the first time would, in that stage, as they're going from wake into sleep, replay visual imagery of Tetris. It was being replayed in their visual cortex, and hippocampus was active again. So there are different stages where different kinds of memories like that consolidate. That is a different kind of a memory than, say, reading a book and learning a new concept, or riding a bike and doing a physical act of learning how to balance for the first time. They all involve different systems and different types of memory. And they actually likely are supported by different types of activity at night. So not just REM sleep, but also non-REM may be very important for certain memories as well. And we think it's not just about laying down memories, it's also about pruning, getting rid of some memories that you don't need, which is interesting because when you think about people who have gone through traumas like PTSD as a result of that, one of the things in PTSD, it's a well-known component, is replaying of dreams, and the dreams being fearful, and those becoming sort of like the problem with the sleep itself, and then replayed in the daytime with fear-based activation. So the limbic system, highly activated during REM sleep, replays the trauma in PTSD. And that in and of itself is one of the problems. And oftentimes that's why REM sleep itself is really a time where you're kind of getting rid of memories as much as laying down. But if it's been captured by a trauma, the constant replay of that in REM is actually one of the problems. So one of the therapies that we use is reducing the sympathetic nervous system's activity so you can get more into the parasympathetic. So alpha-1 blockers are really a well-known therapy within the PTSD world. But getting people out of that REM arousal is really the key. So even medications that reduce REM can sometimes be effective. And interestingly, if you think about a lot of militaries, like say a friend who does anthropology of different things, and some of the militaries way back when, like the Vikings, after a horrible battle, they'd all get drunk. And they'd all use things like mushrooms and things. Yeah. And one of the reasonings behind that potentially is that alcohol, by activating GABA, actually eliminates REM. It's a REM suppressant. And it may be actually a therapeutic way of reducing the chances of PTSD. Yeah. But you also think about, our military, there's a much higher rate of alcoholism and substance abuse. Yeah. And it may be also a similar in response to effect of some of these substances. So normal and abnormal sleep is an interesting thing because it's always normal up until it's not. And
Uh-huh.
what it means by not being normal is that it now is no longer serving its function to support you, becomes maladaptive.
Mm-hmm.
So PTSD is an example that we need to learn things that are scary to keep ourselves safe. But if you take it to the point where it's actually being replayed and it overwhelms the individual, it's no longer adaptive.
Right.
So sleep plays a lot of roles, that the daytime into nighttime. I had a professor in medical school who say, just because you have Parkinson's disease during the day doesn't mean it goes away at night. And that was such a great statement, because people freeze at night. They need longer acting medications, but also there's a whole host of sleep disorders that go along with Parkinson's disease that people didn't recognize for a number of years, like REM behavior disorder, and acting out dreams is very dangerous for them and their bed partners. So I look at it that way. Whatever's happening in the daytime is connected to the night, is connected to the next day.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the symbol, if you think about the symbol for sleep medicine, it's a yin and yang. So night and dark. It's the whole idea that these things are connected. They're not separate.
Yeah. We'll talk about wearables later, but yeah, you're right. People drink alcohol, especially deep sleep is just trashed, but REM, that's interesting about the Vikings and stuff. And I have a lot of associations with various veterans, and alcohol is a real issue. And you're right. It does serve until it doesn't serve. And then it's a problem, but it does it is useful in some regard, but
yeah, I've worked with the Wounded Warrior Project down in Colorado Springs in the past, and trying to help veterans who are undergoing basically trauma-based services also include the sleep components, because a lot of the trauma-based services and even the medical therapies, as well as the psychological therapies, are daytime function.
Yeah,
but the night is often the worst, because it's replay and you feel like you're subject to it. You can't control it; it controls you. And once there's more understanding about sleep and why that is, and then also some approaches to improve sleep itself, it becomes a little bit more controllable, and it gives people a better sense that, hey, there's a way through this. There's an end. There's a light at the end of this tunnel, because it feels pretty darn hopeless for a lot of folks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I didn't cover the one thing you asked me to cover about growth hormone, though.
Oh yeah, that's a cool one. And I do want to talk about, we talked about adenosine, melatonin, cortisol. I mean, we didn't talk about melatonin and cortisol, but I think about the different players that happen throughout the day. Mm-hmm. And I know, before I get into that, the adenosine, like you mentioned, I mean, most of our people should, or if they don't, they do now. But, adenosine kind of builds up throughout the day from different things. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting. What you said before is that if you exercise, or, high performers or athletes, they're churning out and burning more ATP, which is where the adenosine really comes from. I think about adenosine from a lot of different aspects. Like in the ER, we used it to, for SVT, restarting somebody's heart, and it just makes them feel miserable at that high level, quick injection. But
it was horrible feeling that you get when you get an adenosine injection to get somebody out of an arrhythmia. Yeah, it's awful. But, at least.
But as far as, breaking off from the ATP is something, I mean, like after I heard you mention that once, I was like, duh. Yeah, that's where it comes from. Sure.
Yeah.
But go through that a little bit. And then the growth hormone piece, I think it's super important.
Yeah, for sure. So I mentioned adenosine earlier. It really is one of the main triggers for sleep. I mean, there are other things like temperature change, quiet. There are a number of things that add to it. But in terms of neurochemically, that's a well understood concept. It doesn't happen in just one area of the brain, even though I mentioned the ventrolateral preoptic area, or VLPO. That is sort of one of the areas that was first studied and demonstrated in animals and in other species as well as our own. This is area that activates sleep, because after adenosine itself activates the adenosine receptor, it shuts down the arousal centers all throughout the brain. So sleep is actually an active process of inhibiting arousal centers. So the areas like the hypocretin or orexin containing neurons of the posterior hypothalamus, they get inhibited by this area. So does the histaminergic area right next to it in the ventrolateral portion of the hypothalamus gets inhibited by the VLPO, as well as all the other neuroadrenergic, all of the monoaminergic nuclei throughout the brainstem, which basically create arousal, wakefulness, and movement. They are all shut down by this small little group of neurons in the ventrolateral preoptic area. And it's really kind of amazing that there's this, in a sense, a switch that we have in our brain that then shuts off arousal. But it does it in a way that it's not like a all of a sudden shift. It's a slower shift. So you basically are activating areas of the subcortex or inhibiting through activation of GABA. And that can be accentuated by GABAergic activation, but it can also be accentuated by breathing and things that improve vagal tone and parasympathetic activation. Mm-hmm. So you can speed that process, or you can inhibit it. Have a coffee and inhibit your adenosine, or activate arousal and activate anxiety. And all those neurons in those subcortical nuclei will become hyperactive, and it'll be harder to inhibit them. Mm-hmm. Think about it from even the neuroscience side of things, that you really do have some control here. It's not it controls you. It's part of you, and you can actually control it much more so than you think. So that's, in a sense, the adenosine story. There's also a number of other chemicals that are created mainly at night. One of them is growth hormone. And growth hormone, as much as you do a growth hormone workout, and I've done those as a rower myself for many years, you really don't benefit from the growth hormone workout through growth hormone production until you get into deeper stages of non-REM sleep the next night. And that's why oftentimes you get a deepening or activation of the parasympathetic nervous system after these workouts, because that's going to foster longer periods of growth hormone production. Mm-hmm. So that's really one of the understandings, that it's not just about the workout itself, it's the post-workout sleep period that's generating a lot of the downstream benefits. And this is true for a number of things like testosterone production. Mm-hmm. As well. And something that I know, working with like the weightlifters, the US weightlifting team, getting them to understand this. Also, all of a sudden, this became part of my, every weightlifter's protocol. This is part of their program. And the idea of programming sleep as part of your activities is really smart. Because now it's dynamically responsive to what you did that day. And you can optimize, which is a word I use very lightly. Yeah, I like the word resilience around sleep more than optimization, because when we get optimized, it's almost the opposite of resilience. Optimizing is making it kind of fragile and dependent on a lot of things happening. Whereas resilience is, I can sleep no problem. I can sleep anywhere. And I know how to do it. Like, you create your own resilience. So growth hormone, big time associated with that early onset, deeper parasympathetic non-REM sleep. And then as we go through the rest of the night, you get into lighter stages of sleep. And so other neurochemicals are produced during those stages that are actually associated with some of the experimentation that happens in REM sleep. So you'll get activity that's associated with serotonin becomes active. It gets shut down so that acetylcholine actually activates and creates REM sleep. And then serotonin becomes active and shuts it down. So there's a yin and a yang relationship between acetylcholinergic nuclei, which are often arousal, wakeful-based nuclei, things like nicotinic receptors that are activated by nicotine. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that you'll see in the central nervous system. But it also is responsible for creating REM sleep. And then once it becomes active, it also starts to activate the serotonin receptors in the brain in parts of serotonin nuclei, and they inhibit REM. So the idea of a cycle occurring is really the cycle of activation and deactivation. So it's a reciprocal model in your brain that's doing that. And then other things occur that are not necessarily associated with the sleep stages themselves, but with the circadian rhythm. And so you brought up the idea, the melatonin and even cortisol. Melatonin is produced in the pineal gland. It is associated with preparing for sleep. In other words, as the sun goes down, as light becomes less, not lower, melatonin becomes active. In fact, light itself, through the retina activating parts of the hypothalamus again, can actually inhibit melatonin. And it's very important for that reason at night, when you're getting to the later hours of the day, to have less light. It's important to have less light. It's important to watch sundown and mimic that in your house. Because if you turn on all your lights in your house after sundown, you've just ruined your own melatonin preparation for sleep. So keep things in the orange-red zone, keep them low, dim your lights, try not to use overhead lights, and melatonin will slowly increase 5 hours before sleep onset. And within that 5-hour period, as soon as you get to sort of like the asymptote of increase in melatonin, that is sort of the trigger, one of the other triggers for sleep. and melatonin production increases across the first part of the night. And then as the night goes on, it reduces. And in the morning, when you open your eyes, the melatonin is inhibited directly. So you get a sudden shut off of melatonin production. And melatonin, as much as it's associated with sleep, has many other functions. It's anti-inflammatory. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons that it's important for people as they get older, because melatonin levels drop dramatically after the age of 40. You see this big peak in the 20s, and then it slowly comes down in the 30s and into the 40s. And then after the 40s and the 50s, you're at much, much lower levels than you were in your 20s and 30s. So oftentimes, parents will give kids melatonin to sleep.
Yeah.
Probably doesn't work because they already have so much melatonin. It's adults, older adults, that actually a little melatonin supplementation can be valuable. And I don't mean like 5 milligrams of melatonin, under a milligram, taken 5 hours before. In other words, mimic the onset of sleep by taking a little bit of melatonin to help kickstart your own melatonin system and to improve. And actually, lots of studies show that exogenous melatonin itself does not inhibit your own melatonin production. Yeah. So a little bit of melatonin actually helps your melatonin system. And then you get all the other downstream.
You kickstart your own production?
Exactly. And also, like at low levels, that's actually one of the it's big area of research at Oregon State Health University. That's actually where they developed this, and the psych department was doing this research, and they found that these smaller doses, like 300 micrograms, 500 micrograms instead of a whole milligram, that was adequate to get the melatonin system captured, and timing wise would start your melatonin system properly, which is what it's really about. So if you're going to use melatonin as a supplement, you're using it to time your sleep. So if you're jet lagged or if you're moving from place to place, it's a helpful component to improve your chances of moving or shifting your timing of sleep. It is not a great, what we call soporific. It's not a great sleep aid. It can be temporarily, but it's really better at activating timing. Yeah. Melatonin it's kicked around a lot. I can talk about, where to use it, why not to use it. But the one thing I'll tell you is that melatonin is nowhere near as valuable as light. As I mentioned, as soon as you open your eyes in the morning, shuts off melatonin. Melatonin runs away from light. So if you use melatonin thinking that's going to improve, you might want to think about using light. Yeah. And light itself as an activator of your circadian rhythm in the morning. Because the other thing that happens as you get closer to the morning hours is you start to produce cortisol, the wake promoting and also sympathetically surged sort of neurochemical, also made in the hypothalamus. It is something that starts when you open your eyes, and melatonin goes down, cortisol goes up. And you get your cortisol peak in the morning, which is also where we see a lot of heart attacks and strokes, unfortunately, because we're just also seeing sympathetic surges. So once the sympathetic nervous system activates, cortisol goes up, sustaining it. So you get both a neural and humoral response to wake and to sleep. The neural humoral activity for sleep is the neural is the ventrolateral preoptic area inhibiting everything that was arousal. The humoral or the hormone version is pineal gland making melatonin. Same thing with wakefulness. The activation of the arousal centers, the hypocretin centers, the histaminergic centers, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin promotes wakefulness. That's the nervous system activity. And then the hormone is cortisol. So cortisol promotes wakefulness and activates the rest of the body, synchronizing tissues to work on a similar time with the suprachiasmatic nucleus conducting wakefulness. So it's really important that light timing in the morning for people is consistent. In other words, getting up at the same time is the most important part of your day, not what time you went to bed. It's what time you woke up. Because you went to bed at 11 o'clock and wake up at 6, great. Then all of a sudden one day you went to bed at 1. Get up at 6. Force yourself to get up and go. Your cortisol will keep you awake. A little caffeine will reduce some of that adenosine that's still hanging around because sleep gets rid of the adenosine. But throughout the day, if you stay awake, your drive for sleep is going to be so much higher that next night is going to be incredibly good and really helpful. And keep getting up at that same wake up time, because circadian rhythm is really how you create the timing and duration requirements that you need and also improve your quality.
You said if you have a late night too, I don't know how old your kids are. Whenever they get older and like 18 and 20, it's like they're up late. So if you want to have a conversation, it's really tapping into your bedtime.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know,
I look at it this way. My kids, I have kids who are 30.
oh, wow.
My oldest is 30.
Yeah.
My daughter is 28. One of my sons is 25. He'll be 26 this year.
Okay.
And I've got a little guy who's going to be 13.
Okay.
So I've got a little bit of a spread. I get to see, across all of their times, they're all really good sleepers. They're all taught to sleep early from the beginning. This is important. But yeah, their natural circadian rhythm, which is your chronotype, is something that is uniquely them. So like, I know my middle daughter, Julia, is 28. She's getting married this year.
Yeah.
Julia is a late night owl. Is a late owl. And she is a scientifically driven person, very intelligent. A lot of our creative science and art people are delayed, actually, it turns out. There's an actual association study with this. And it turns out that the early morning people are like my oldest, Haley. They called her grandma from like high school on because she'd get tired by 9 o'clock and she had to go to bed. But she gets up. She's up in the morning. She's like a firefighter. She can get up at right the moment and go.
Right.
And she is, the typical sort of like person who runs organizations.
Mm-hmm.
She runs like a part of the Mariners. So she worked for the Yankees and now she works for the Mariners, and she runs the business aspects. So she's up early, sets the rules, this is the agenda. Turns out a lot of our lawyers and people who set the rules are early people. And the people who have to live by them are the ones who are the artists and the scientists who are up all night long doing their work. So I've got two of them and two different girls and two of my daughters.
It's their signature, their chronotype. Yeah, that's cool.
Exactly. Yeah, they're very much themselves.
What is your chronotype? While we're on that,
I'm right in the middle.
Yeah.
So most of us, 66.7% of us are in the middle of that bell curve, are what we call N types.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are four other types described by the original morningness, eveningness questionnaire that has been around since the 70s. Those other, stepping right outside of the first standard deviation, is the moderate evening and moderate day morning type. Mm-hmm. And then there's the definite evening and definite morning types, which are another standard deviation out. This is such a small fraction. The people that call themselves night owls and morning larks, like the truly early and really, really late, small percentage of our population, maybe 5% at most, from in that realm, in those two realms. Then you kind of walk into the N type. It's like 67, almost 70% of us are in the N type. Yeah. Being N type, by the way, is actually really preferable because that means you can adjust easily. You can delay, you can advance, you can go back and forth. People who are more in the morning type tend to do as well. People who are more the late type tend to have more trouble adjusting to time shifts and also have more issues. There's been a lot of studies around the mismatch with culture, that late types are not looked at favorably compared to early types. It's like, the old saying, if you're early, you're on time. If you're on time, you're late. If you're late, that's not acceptable. Yeah. So that favors early morning people, not the people who are late night type, oftentimes people. So there's a lot more mental health issues in that group. Turns out there's a lot more depression and anxiety, 2 times as much compared to morning types. So there's been a number of studies around chronotypes as well. But yeah, I'm an N type. I kind of live right in the middle. Yeah. How about you? What do you think? What do you think you are?
Yeah, me too. It's the only thing that sucks. Well, there's a lot of things that, it's great. It has its own greatness getting older, but you're kind of stuck waking up early. It doesn't matter if you go to a concert late at night. You're not sleeping in till noon. There's no more 10-hour, sleep sessions or 12 hours. My son can sleep for 12 hours, no problem. But, if you go to bed late, you get home, we went to the Thunder game 2 nights ago. It was a late start, 8:30 local. And, got home late and wind down and stuff and still up 6:30, whatever, 7.
That's going to be, one of the other things, one of the dimensions of circadian rhythm is not just the frequency, like when it occurs, late or early.
Yeah.
So that curve itself can be longer, which is the delay, or shorter, which is the people who are advanced, the morning lark types. There's also amplitude. So one of the things that is really interesting, and the science has demonstrated this in the last couple of years, is that maybe last 10 years actually, that kids going through the puberty change of delay, so their frequency is they're getting much longer in terms of their circadian rhythm, delayed going to bed. Not only that, the amplitude of the wake and sleep lowers. So they're sleepier in the daytime and they're more easily arousable at night. So their sleep is not as high quality as it used to be. Mm-hmm. And their daytime is not always wakeful, as wakeful promoting as it can be. And some kids with a delay that's very delayed, like some kids have actually delayed sleep phase wake disorder, mm-hmm. meaning that they can't get sleepy until 1 o'clock at night. That's way outside of the distribution. That population also has this low amplitude. And so their ability to stay awake, even in school, is hard. Mm-hmm. And so this is the population where light therapy is so important, because light therapy in the morning will capture not just an earlier start time for the circadian system, it'll accentuate the arousal rise. So you'll see a higher amplitude as well as a shortening the frequency or reducing the frequency of the circadian rhythm itself. So that's another thing we see with kids. I mean, my 12-year-old is at that point. He's hit puberty. I mean, I drive him home from school in the afternoon and he's asleep. Yeah. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, falling asleep in the back of the car. Part of that is circadian rhythm, because that little lull in the midday, that might be part of it. But it's not like he was, he's in sixth grade, finishing sixth grade, 3 years ago in fourth grade or third grade, up in the back of the car. Hey, Dad, right. Talk. Because the arousal was much more of a high amplitude. Now he's come down. So accentuating drives for arousal in that population is really important. And that actually occurs later in life too. There is a blunting, and we see this with dementias when we see people, quote unquote, having sundowning. The sundowning itself right. is the transition between wake and sleep. It's usually in the evenings. And when the light goes down, there's no activity in the central nervous system to keep the amplitude up. So they quickly drop below the amplitude line and fall into a period of kind of confusion that is driven by not being able to identify the environment very well. So there's a lot of studies around light therapy for sundowning, and it seems to be very effective at reducing the sundowning problems that folks have as they get older.
So like kids or people in general, or, like your son, or whenever you talk about light therapy, does that mean just like having soft lights in your house, or?
Oh, no, it actually means therapeutically using light. So the idea, just in general, having daytime, if you can watch the sunrise in the morning, that has a lot of help, that helps the circadian rhythm activate. Yeah. If you can't do that because you live someplace that is really high in the middle of the winter, or it is winter, the next step is to use a light therapy. And a light therapy box is the one that has been traditionally used by people who live all over Minnesota, who have to live through the winter. A lot of my friends at Mayo Clinic use them in their offices. Right. And you use that as a stimulus in the morning. You don't look at it, but it basically is retinal input to the peripheral retina. The peripheral retina preferentially activates the SCN and the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's not going to visual cortex. It's going to serve the function of activating arousal through this hypothalamus. So just getting 15 minutes of that kind of light exposure, which could be in the white light, just sort of broad spectrum light, is great because it includes all the colors. But also you can use limited frequency in the blue-green realm that activates specifically at even lower luxes. So you can use 10,000 lux white light, or you can use a 5,000 lux blue and green light. Activates the SCN, increasing amplitude and capturing onset, so that you can activate your natural circadian rhythm even when there's darkness outside. So that's something we use just for 15, 20 minutes in the morning for people who are delayed. In other words, they would go to bed too late. That's our kids in high school, my kid, your kid. But in the older population, the issue is no longer delay, it's advance. Like you just mentioned, I get up at 6 o'clock every morning. Doesn't matter what time I went to bed. That can actually become 4 o'clock in the morning as you get older. And that can be a problem because you get up at 4, it's dark. Yeah. And so what do? You go out walking, or you do things. So you're creating more arousal in a time when you actually should be, in a sense, sleeping. So what we do is we use light therapy at night. And we do this in the hours before bed to extend bedtime, to actually open the window. In other words, delay sleep. And when we delay sleep, we delay the wake up time. So
Yeah.
instead of going to bed at 6 o'clock at night and getting up at 3, now you're going to go to bed at 9 and get up at 6.
Uh-huh.
And that is something we can also do with light therapy. And sometimes you can combine melatonin as well to help trigger sleep at the appropriate time. That's been done as well in demonstrating that the combination effects can be even a little bit more than just the light therapy itself. But it really does need to be timed properly. It does need to actually fit in the window. There's actually a phase response curve associated with this. So you actually medically have to put them in the right spot to get the light therapy so that you get the right effect. Because you can do just the opposite if you give them a little melatonin at the wrong time and light therapy at the wrong time.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to tell people, look, if you really are considering light therapy, let's talk about it first. How do you do it? What's a good tool to use? Because the best tool is in the sky.
Right.
But if you don't have the sun, what's a good tool? And there are glasses you can wear that have blue light glasses. There are these devices you can put on your desk to actually, get that during the first hours of the morning. There's even studies showing that if you run in the morning, like on a treadmill, and you put a light therapy box in, it improves your running. It turns out it has a benefit. Yeah, because it's activating arousal. So the idea is that if you can activate arousal, your actual cardiovascular activity will better mimic what you need for performance. So in some cases, we use a little light therapy with morning workouts. If that's an athlete. Yeah, for sure.
Well, cool. Well, so the next thing I do want to get into is some sleep disorders, and I want to get into common ways how we screw. I mean, you've discussed deeply into, sleep, what's going on. I mean, it's a dynamic process, but I mean, I want to get into all the ways we screw that up, which are many. And and then some common problems that you see in like athletics, high performers, and that sort of thing. And then like the sympathetic overdrive, like whenever I did this, absolute rest, kind of, you have basically two tiers. One is where you wear that bulky ring, which we'll talk about more later. But I had a lot of sympathetic overdrive, and it was just, and all this fragmented sleep garbage, which was very, very disheartening. But
actually, it gives you something to work on. Put it that way.
Yeah. I tell you, it's made me totally revamp the way I think in the evening, my mornings. I thought I had that kind of dialed in, but I really, I'll go on a walk in the evening by myself, just listening to birds, feeling the sun go down, absolutely no screens, and just trying to wind down with some other exercises as well. But to try to, get out of that, but we can talk about that later. But anyway, what are some ways commonly that we screw that up that you see in high performers and all that, and how you kind of deal with that? But
we screw things up a lot for ourselves when it comes to sleep. It's actually something that's also cultural, which I kind of touched on earlier, that, we don't really value sleep as a culture. And it's something we teach our kids, and then they kind of live their life that way. Unfortunately, athletes are just the same as everybody else. They're taught the same things about their sleep sometimes. Now, we're starting to educate within that population a lot more than we used to. But the biggest problem I think people create for themselves is irregularity, creating an irregular schedule for themselves, or putting things in that actually limit their sleep opportunity. So that, getting up too early for an extra workout rather than sleeping and getting the sleep that they needed to recover properly. So I think a lot of it is around regularity and creating a routine that also includes sleep. So you're not just flopping into the bed. You're actually setting yourself up for the activation of your parasympathetic nervous system. That's what we screw up the most. So we hop on our social media. We bring our phones to bed with us. People have televisions in their bedrooms. I think people are learning that's not a good thing, more so than in the past. But all of these daytime activities and light-driven activities are novelty-seeking activities. If you're seeking novelty at bedtime, it's absolutely antithetical to what sleep is. Sleep is the time for boredom. It's a time for turning it off, for deep breathing, so that you can actually put yourself into a trance-like state that will help you transition into sleep. So that's, I think, the biggest mistake people make, is the idea that, a little bit of Instagram at this hour is not going to hurt me.
Right.
Or, emails. If you're, a little bit of a workaholic, there needs to be a separation, and it needs to be a transition. And the way I explain that to people is, like, in the morning when you get out of bed, do you just take off the clothes you wore to bed, put on clothes, and walk out the door? No, never. You don't do that unless there's a fire, right? You get ready. You take a shower. You brush your teeth.
Yeah.
You have breakfast. You take your supplements, your medications. You get the kids out, the dogs out.
Yeah.
There's a process. There's a routine.
Yeah.
And we built that routine around the morning because we want to perform well. And that's actually the reason for the routine, because we're efficient. Take that same mentality and apply it to before bed, because you need to transition, and creating a transition is more important, even more, I would argue, than in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the morning, you're going through a routine. But if you had walked out of the door with the cup of coffee rather than had it and read your paper, you'd probably still be okay. But at night, if you're going to watch television all the way up to bedtime, there's no way you're going to be as successful as if you hadn't. And I put it that way. It's not about being perfect. It's not about making things just right and living in a geosphere for sleep. But it really is about eliminating some of the simple stuff that you know to be impactful for you. So like when we study people with that autonomic testing ring, that device, it gives us a clear indication of how quickly their parasympathetic nervous system activates to deactivate their sympathetic nervous system. And some people, it takes an hour. And some people, it takes 30 minutes. There are some people that just don't. They're so high anxiety, or they're so driven by their thought process, they just don't warm down. Mm-hmm. And so what we have to do is often meet people where they are, give them cognitive and behavioral tools, as well as change the environment so they can build a routine. A lot of people actually build up a lot of fear around their sleep, believe it or not. And so they see their bed in their bedroom as a challenge. And like, oh, here we go again, another night. Or I've got a huge game tomorrow, or a performance I have to do, or a meeting I have to attend, or a presentation. And for that reason, going to bed has like a sense of, oh no, I'm dreading tomorrow. And the cognitive wheels start going, and the anxiety drives sympathetic surge. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be a way to, in a sense, create distance between your day and tomorrow from your sleep period. So protecting it, building a routine in so that you can foster the onset of sleep with parasympathetic tone. So I think that's the biggest mistake I think people make. And then culturally on top of that is our culture of not really valuing the idea of taking care of your sleep. It's much more about sleep is the end of the day. I'll just pop on a couch and fall asleep there, whatever. That is just the opposite cognitive structure I like to have people think about. Don't think about it as the end of the day. Think about it as the beginning of the next day. Mm-hmm. So did you actually prepare for the next day tonight or not? Mm-hmm. And if you didn't, predict a bad day or predict a day that's not going to go the way you're hoping, or you're going to have to struggle a little bit more to get through that day. Why do that if you know you can actually protect your sleep, not drink alcohol, not do all those things that create arousal and wakefulness, and really kind of use your sleep, optimize, in a sense, the impact of your sleep so that your resilience in the daytime is far better. I mean, we do that with athletes all the time. There's something called sleep banking. Yeah. And what sleep banking is about is just adding small incremental time periods. So just 15 minutes, go to bed 15 minutes earlier than you normally do. Get up at the same time. Remember, that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And then maybe push it to a half hour before, a week or so before a big meet or a big event. And then when you travel to the event, which is also an issue for a lot of athletes, you're going to be a little sleep deprived, but the banking effect actually protects your performance. So a little bit of extra sleep protects that performance. Once they start to see that, now you want to protect your sleep. And your routine at the beginning of the night is the most important routine of the day. Mm-hmm. It turns out it's more important than any morning routine you do. And that becomes protected. So a lot of the athletes learn that from us, learn that from working with us, that routine that you can transfer that routine to a new location, to a pre-workout, to a pre-performance.
Yeah.
But the idea of protecting your sleep and using it as a performance enhancing component, which is totally legal, is really the idea. And actually, I kind of made the joke. I think the New York Times picked this up when we were doing the 2020 Olympic Games. We had a circadian rhythm camp in Honolulu for the weightlifters. And we spent 2 weeks there reacclimating them to Tokyo time, 7 hours off Honolulu, and flew to the country, perform really well and came back. So it was really interesting because I made a statement like, there's all this issue of like performance enhancing drugs in weightlifting, and it's actually pervasive in many countries, not the US, but other countries. And it's created a lot of problems around around weightlifting as even an Olympic sport being considered. But here's something that no one else is really doing, which is completely legal and enhances your performance, sleep. And so it becomes something that you can utilize for your own performance on a day-to-day basis. So
you guys stopped over 2 weeks on the way over there. Isn't that I didn't know you spent 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Really give it time.
Yeah, we actually did. We were there for, I think, 3 weeks because it was that we had some lifters coming in at different times depending when they were there. So we were there for 3 weeks running the camp in a hotel. But by the time they were already shifting towards Honolulu when they were in the US. Mm-hmm. So I had them starting to shift, their sleep and wake times closer to Honolulu. In other words, delaying, getting later and later. Yeah. And then even their workouts for like the month before they came to see us, they were doing their last workouts instead of like 6 o'clock at night at like 10 o'clock at night.
Gotcha.
And getting up later, like getting up at 9 o'clock in the morning rather than 6 o'clock in the morning, eating on that off schedule, protecting visual, like actually wearing sunglasses so that they would not be awake at night, but then also, activating with light in the daytime. And also we banked a little bit. So a little extra sleep for the flight. Got to Honolulu, and then we shifted them even further, 7 more hours. And in about a 2-week span, I can get them about within 2 hours of the Tokyo time zone. They were lifting at like midnight. Their last, 1 o'clock in the morning was their last lift, but that's Honolulu time. In Japan, that was perfectly aligned with when they're going to perform. Right. So we created a performance-based circadian rhythm camp. It was kind of fun.
I bet it sounds like fun. Jeff, I wanted to ask you, you'd mentioned getting people in parasympathetic prior to bed and how we, comparing that to our morning routine, comparing our evening routine to that and getting that mindset. As you work with athletes and high performers, what are some things you run into? What are some tricks, or tweaks that you do in the evening? Okay, let's do A, B, and C. These are going to change, move the needle for you. What's the secret sauce there?
There's not one secret sauce because humans are all different, right? Yeah. But one thing that we do apply in our programming at Upstate Rest in particular, and that has a significant impact, is a therapeutic approach that comes out of psychology called acceptance commitment therapy, or ACT therapy. It's a type of cognitive therapy that goes along with cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which is well known and well understood. ACT grew out of that. It grew out of the cognitive aspects of cognitive behavioral therapy. And what it does is, instead of challenging an irrational thought, which is kind of what cognitive restructuring is about in CBT, it actually aligns with your values rather than this is the right thing to do. What are your values? My values are, I want to perform really well. I want to sleep well. Or my values may be, I want to protect my health. Those are your values. And underlying what you do along those values is you basically sit with the uncomfortable nature of not being able to sleep if you're having problems sleeping, or the idea that I can accept where I am right now without penalizing myself. So not focusing on the negative, but focus on the positive, the value that this creates. Rest is important. You don't focus on sleep, just focus on rest. And so one of the things we do with athletes and high performers of many kinds, these are very highly strung, seriously minded individuals that are so regimented and disciplined that often that disciplined mindset gets in the way. That I'm not sleeping. What the hell's wrong with me? I'm gonna sleep. I'm gonna force this thing to happen. That's just the opposite. We want them to sit back in it, be comfortable I'm not sleeping, understand that I'm resting, and commit yourself to the good things that you know you need to do, the behaviors you need to do, the thought process, meditation principles, breathing, heart rate variability, biofeedback is something we do in our program. So using and learning tools to help put yourself into the parasympathetic tone that you need for sleep. And ACT is a really good way to approach it, because what you think is then what you do. Versus what you do makes you think. So we really need to get people's thought processes in line. And many high level athletes have incredibly strong mindsets about like, I can do anything, which is good. That's how you perform.
Right.
But that can kind of get in the way when they're not sleeping. Like it almost becomes, in a way, a lot of the superstition that can develop in sports comes from that kind of like, if I do this, then that'll happen. And these consequences and actions are not necessarily connected.
Mm-hmm.
They're basically separate things, but that becomes connected in the mind. So we have to unravel that and separate just because I'm not sleeping doesn't mean you're not going to perform well. It means that you're resting, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we get you to sleep? So that's one of the things that I think a lot of athletes benefit from. And insomnia is a very common issue with athletes. It's about performance. And a lot of the things that athletes do, because they're younger individuals oftentimes, not all athletes, but a lot of the ones at the high levels or highest levels of sport, they're actually at a phase where they're a little delayed in their circadian rhythms. They're up at night after events at times, being interviewed by the press or at parties or being pulled into social situations, which are probably not great for their next day.
Right.
So there's a lot of learning around what to do to protect yourself and how you need to protect sleep. We have some professional athletes that can't get to bed until 2:00 in the morning after a night game.
Right.
And 2:00 in the morning is really tough when you have to get up and get on a plane and fly to the next city in the morning. So what do we do there? That's where we're going to teach a bunch of tools. Also, get you out of the media. You do one media thing, and then you go right to the hotel and you start your routine, rather than out to the party, out to like meet more people or talk with fans. Really trying to reduce that impact and get your sleep timing better. But then also, maybe we also delay your sleep a little bit so that you have more recovery sleep if you have the ability to sleep in, which younger folks do compared to older people. So that's another thing we often will do as well. Yeah, insomnia is the most common symptom that people have for sleep issues. And it's one of the three most common sleep disorders. The most common is obstructive sleep apnea or sleep disorder breathing. And then probably number 2 is restless leg syndrome. People don't realize how common that is. It's around 10% of the population. And then insomnia is right around the same number. In terms of chronic, persistent, what we call psychophysiologic insomnia, that's more like 8%, 5% of the population. But the symptom of insomnia, 40% of the population has that at any given day. Yeah. The most common symptom, though, is often daytime sleepiness. So daytime sleepiness is one of the most common complaints we get. And there's so many different reasons for that, right? Duration, timing, quality, but also what are you doing at night? What is the regularity, jet lags, social jet lag? Worked with a bunch of professional football players in Atlanta when I was at Emory. And a number of the football players were also DJs and rap artists and things. And so they'd stay up to 2:00 in the morning and record. Like, what are you doing, man? So it was sort of like how to do a lot of teaching around that. But, again, getting into the ACT concept, if that's valuable to you, we got it. But let's talk about what else is valuable to you, which is your NFL career, which everyone knows in the NFL, it stands for not for long.
Yeah.
That's something that you want to be in that as long as you possibly can, right?
Yeah.
So let's optimize that concept versus becoming a DJ right now.
There's another thing I want to mention. You talked about, we talked before we started recording a little bit about marijuana, its activities on sleep. I've got a patient that I've got a handful that have kind of come off it. And what I found is, like, there was this one guy, he's in his 40s, that great guy. He stopped. He'd been using it for years, finally sold his company. He's not really working right now, and he's in a good position, but he always used that to try to get him to sleep. And he came to see us, and he was a new patient, and so we kind of had him stop taking that. His sleep dramatically improved. And he said that I've had vivid dreams now. I never realized I haven't had dreams for like 10 plus years. Is that something you see? I mean, everything you talked more about, the structure of sleep and all that, and REM sleep. Is that something that's really hit pretty hard with THC or? Yeah,
THC is, it's really interesting. The research in THC, a lot of it came from the Veterans Administration research itself, but especially with pain and pain syndromes, things like that. But the sleep aspects of the research actually are a little sort of all over the place in terms of what the effects are. And part of that's because cannabinoid receptors themselves are are very active in many different places.
Right.
They are like co-active within a number of synapses. There's not just like a cannabinoid receptor. It's mixed in with other effects. So you can get a lot of effects based on the type of THC or the type of cannabinoid itself that's being put into the system. So like if you just look at THC itself, like pure like dronabinol, something that's extracted, those studies are pretty clear. They actually show REM inhibition. They show lightening of deep sleep, increasing sleep onset. So in other words, latency goes down, quicker to fall asleep, but the sleep quality is not necessarily better. When you look at like smoked marijuana or THC combinations with all the other CBD, CBN components, it's much less it's much less clear what the actual effects are. So what I've seen recently in terms of sleep disorders around THC is that if you use THC in low dose and you combine it with other medications, one in particular, acetazolamide, Diamox, in low dose, like 125 milligrams and 2.5 milligrams of THC, dronabinol actually, you can actually reduce sleep disordered breathing up to 40%. So it's had significant benefits in certain populations. It hasn't been well defined which populations are benefiting from this. There's a lot of research that needs to be done. And this was, in a sense, a pilot double-blind placebo-controlled study. So it wasn't 1,000 people, it was 100 or so. And I think this shows that there are some positive effects on sleep, but generally it's not going to be effective for people who don't have things like sleep disordered breathing or don't have specific issues that you're using the dronabinol and the acetazolamide for. So all that to say that, THC is legal all over the place, right? Yeah. And people use it for recreational purposes as well as medical purposes. It's unclear whether there is a medical purpose for marijuana in sleep, but I think the evidence is suggesting that it could be of value for sleep disordered breathing patients, but we don't know enough yet. So we're starting to experiment with it in populations, especially at altitude. So like I live in Denver, you're in Colorado. This is we're all mile high or higher. You go to Breckenridge, you're 2 miles high, and you'll see sleep disordered breathing. Somebody with a little bit of sleep disordered breathing in Austin, Texas, comes to Denver and it goes from mild to moderate. And then they go to Breckenridge, it goes to severe and can even become complex with central sleep disordered breathing. The Diamox therapy is something we've used for many years for altitude-based illnesses, altitude sickness, but also altitude-induced central sleep disorder breathing because it changes pH. So that's something that's interesting. But if you combine it with THC, it actually will help people that are not at altitude with sleep disorder breathing, which is kind of interesting. So I did a little experiment with one of our clients who actually lives in Austin, Texas, comes to Denver, and they have a house out near Breckenridge in the 10,000, 11,000 feet realm. Yeah. And no sleep disordered breathing in Austin. In Denver, moderate sleep disordered breathing in the mountains, 50 events an hour. and they've been they both have this issue, and they both report for years going to their house up in the mountains, they can't sleep. They sleep like crap. They try oxygen, doesn't work. But when they come back down, they sleep okay. So, I tried it out with them, the THC, the dronabinol, and the acetazolamide, and lo and behold, it knocked it down quite a bit. They went from normally being moderate to severe. They stayed mild to moderate in both realms. So kind of interesting that it may have that effect. There's also medications coming out. There's a company called Apnimed that's been developing a combination medication that is going to work a little bit differently. It's more adrenergic activating in the central nervous system to open up the airway. So there's going to be a population of people that do benefit from that as well. There's some definite things that, sleep disordered breathing is a big problem for a large population. Then it's a very underserved population. Only around 20% of people with sleep disordered breathing that's causing problems are under therapy. Vast majority. It's familial. So if you snore and somebody else snores in the family, it's likely you have the genetics for it. Doesn't mean snoring does not mean you have sleep apnea, but it's a sign that you may. So it's good to check it out. 60% of guys have snoring, 40% of women. So it's not that we have 60% of people with sleep apnea. It's more like 20%. So it's good to get it checked out to see where you are on the spectrum of sleep disordered breathing. Is it just snoring, or are we talking something that's more medically significant.
Yeah, I like the
but
way
these
you
are a lot
talk
of
about it
options.
like a spectrum, really, because everybody has some
Yeah.
degree, it doesn't, it's not an
Yes.
on and off switch. Yeah.
No. It is human to have sleep disordered breathing. I tell all my clients, some of them are high level athletes. They're like, but that's what obese old people have. I'm like, no, this is what all humans have.
Yeah.
From that Adam's apple on up, your airways only held up by muscle tone. When you go to sleep at night, some people relax more than others. It's just like some people have higher reflexes than others.
Yeah.
Same thing here. It's genetic. You have the chances of sucking your airway closed like everybody else does.
Yeah.
That's why 5 an hour is considered normal.
Really?
So 5 sleep disordered breathing events an hour is totally considered normal. When we get to 5 to 15, that's in the mild zone. 15 to 30 is considered moderate. Over 30 is considered severe. Now, unfortunately, that has become pervasive to the point where we only think in terms of what's called apnea-hypopnea index or respiratory disturbance index, the speed limit concept.
Yeah.
It's really the effect that the breathing is having. Are those 30 events an hour having huge impact on your cardiovascular system? Or is it not really?
Mm-hmm.
Or how about the 15 events an hour or 14 events an hour? Is that having more of an effect? And I've seen people with what we call mild at 13 or 14 events an hour, all kinds of activation, cardiovascular activation through the night, sympathetic surges occurring.
Yeah.
And I've seen people at 30 events an hour, no hypoxic burden, just a little bit of arousal throughout the night. So which one's worse? Is it the 30 an hour with a little bit of arousal or 15 events an hour with lots of arousal? And it's hard. We don't have the answer to that question, but we definitely need to follow sleep disordered breathing differently than we do now. Polysomnographic testing on one night is just not enough.
Yeah.
You might miss the variability from night to night. So that's why longitudinal testing with devices that look at autonomic system as well as register oxygen drops or arousals, that's why you need to see more about the central nervous system when you're managing it. Because I can see putting people on CPAP devices, for instance, is something we do, but we have a lot of other therapies that we use before we get to oral appliances and CPAPs.
Mm-hmm.
What we find is that we can accentuate your normal breathing, nasal breathing at night. We can actually increase the strength or power of your neuromuscular control of breathing using something called expiratory muscle strength training, which has also been shown to reduce sleep disordered breathing quite efficaciously. And you may not need to get to a medical therapy if you're doing these things properly. Non-supine positioning, another major impact of sleep disordered breathing. So we can do a lot of that before we even get to CPAP or any of those other devices. Because once you put somebody on something that's going to have to be worn on a night-to-night basis, you can kind of make the sympathetic nervous system worse. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes the apnea gets better really quickly with CPAP, but all of a sudden fragmentation goes up. All of a sudden sympathetic activity. And it takes days or weeks for them to get back to where they were. And that echoes the experience. People put CPAP on for the first time. If they do it properly with some behavioral desensitization, it's a lot nicer to do it. That's how we do it. But most people will just get it from their DME, from their doctor, and slap it on and try to sleep with it. And it's just horrible. And so they'll end up, getting rid of it and telling terrible stories about CPAP. It's because they didn't use it in the right sequence and they didn't open up their nasal airway and learn how to sleep first before they used it.
There's a lot of other steps to do before you just jump on the bandwagon of CPAP.
Yeah. For sure. It takes 2 weeks for us to get somebody on a CPAP in our hands. Yeah.
You glossed over something called expiratory strength training. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so so in pulmonary medicine, as you know, pulmonary function tests, PFTs, put people in a box, have them breathe, and you can find out all kinds of things about expiratory phase and inspiratory phase. One of the things that pulmonologists have been using in COPD patients for a number of years is the ability to improve expiratory phase activity, because it's usually lower airway obstructions like COPD, emphysema, asthma, leave CO2. And the belief is that if you train the expiratory muscles, which is not largely the diaphragm, that's inspiratory, but expiratory muscles all across the body, you improve eliminating the gas, the CO2. So it's been a mainstay in treating people with expiratory phase sleep breathing issues. Yeah. Well, it turns out that population also has a lot of sleep apnea, and it's because they don't have as much caudal forces in their pulmonary system to help hold the upper airway open. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, when you use expiratory muscle strength training for COPD, finding all of a sudden it improves sleep disordered breathing at night. And it's likely because when you're breathing out, if you think about when you're breathing in, apnea occurs on inspiratory phase.
Mm-hmm.
When you breathe out, you're opening the air, you're opening the airway.
Right.
So if you're using neuromuscular activity and blowing against a force,
right.
expiratory, like it's basically 25 breaths a day into this device, you're training your nervous system to overcome resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And you're training your nervous system to activate on the expiratory phase, which holds open the airway while you're sleeping at night. Inspiratory doesn't do it. So the inspiratory muscle strength training, which you'll see a lot of athletes use for increasing volume, and like swimmers do it, a lot of triathlon type sports do this as well. It helps with diaphragmatic excursion and opening up airway, but it doesn't help sleep disordered breathing.
Yeah.
So expiratory muscle strength training, or EMST, in a really well controlled study in just last year, actually it was the end of last year, beginning of this year, demonstrated that it can reduce over a 12-week period, reduce the apnea-hypopnea index by 50%. So I can take somebody 30 events an hour and drop them to 15 down to 7. So we put EMST training in to everyone's sleep disorder breathing program, because it's just going to improve your natural breathing. Like we also do the same thing with nasal airflow. We know that oral airflow is turbulent. It doesn't hold the airway open. Nasal is laminar, holds the airway open. So we work with ENTs to make sure there's no nasal turbinate issues, deviated septums. Don't do anything in the oral pharynx at all. There's no reason to take out tonsils. There's no reason to take tongue tissue out or all that stuff, unless there's a real anatomic issue, like a very small mandible, which those kind of surgeries do help, because we want you to breathe through your nose, not through your mouth. In fact, after we've got people breathing well through their nose using nasal inhaled steroids. We even use like the intake device to open up the nasal airflow at night, and then non-supine sleeping position. That's when we'll add mouth tape.
Yeah.
So once they've actually gotten good, right. So we'll use mouth tape, but you have to use it properly. That's why a lot of people get mouth tape. They think it's going to cure something, and it makes it worse, or they feel claustrophobic because they've not accentuated their nasal breathing yet. It's the same problem with CPAP. If you throw a CPAP onto somebody, a nasal CPAP on somebody who has congestion, you just made it worse.
Yeah.
So they're never going to use it. So we take people through a lot of steps to improve your natural breathing, including EMST, which you'll do for that point going forward, and then add a medical therapy or a dental oral appliance to hold the airway open. They become much more successful, efficacious, comfortable with the medical or dental therapy after we've done all of those other steps. Plus, we've also implemented a cognitive approach. So how to think about your CPAP, how to learn to breathe with your CPAP, getting adjusted to the idea of pressure. It's not oxygen. It's not breathing for you. It's just when you take a breath, it supports your breathing. When you breathe out, it reduces. So it becomes a comfort and a trial and error, and you do it during wakefulness.
Yeah.
So nobody gets a CPAP in our program starts using it right now at night. For the first week, just put it on, breathe first off with a mask on, get comfortable with that. Then attach a hose and start breathing for a little while you're awake, just to see what it feels like.
Yeah.
And don't use it at night. It's okay. Just sleep in the non-supine position, head up, you'll get past it. But for at least a week, just use it in the daytime. Maybe even if you want, take a nap. It's the only time we allow naps, by the way. Take a little nap, but see what it feels like. Just get a sense of it. Get comfortable. Do some breathing exercises. We go through a whole bunch of different breathing exercises. And then the first time you try it at night, it's not meant to be used all night. We just this is a tool. We want you to see how comfortable it is. Try to go to sleep with it. And if you take it off in the middle of the night, that's fine. We're going to increase that over time. So the idea is that by the end of 2 weeks of using it at night, generally people are using it all night. They're comfortable enough with it. But that's really something that needs significant alteration. The way we do it in medicine right now is, here's the device. Good luck.
Yeah,
and
archaic.
Just wants you to use it so they get paid in 3 months.
Yeah. Yeah.
So very different.
Briefly, one more thing before I get into some, I want to talk about wearables. I'm going to talk about absolute rest. Absolute rest is, a 3-month plus program, the deep dive one. But back to the expiratory strength training, the way I'm hearing you talk about that is almost like you're developing those muscles and developing that structure so it can maintain and stay open and not be so collapsible at night, to kind of improving your degree of sleep apnea. right?
It's if you think about it's a reflex arc.
Yeah.
So basically at night, the way you protect your airway is through a reflex arc.
Yeah.
You're not conscious of your airway closing.
Right.
But your airway, when it touches itself, activates neurons that then create arousal to open the airway.
Yeah.
If you're training your neuromuscular system to enhance opening the airway, that's what your EMST is doing. So it's not about making muscles stronger. It says strength training. It's probably a misnomer. It's more expiratory it's expiratory neuromuscular training. In other words, your neuromuscular activity of expiratory phase breathing is being trained so that at night, the reflex arc is more active. And that is likely what is protecting your airway. And that's likely also what's reducing apnea, hypopnea, indice. It's certainly not a cure-all, but it's certainly something that should be included in everyone's sleep disorder breathing routine, especially if you're going to use CPAP or oral appliance, because oral appliance, first of all, relies on muscle tone. If you don't have good muscle tone, like if you have what's called REM-related sleep apnea or supine-dependent apnea, where the jaw falls back, it's unlikely an oral appliance will be that effective because there's no tone on which that you're pulling on the hyoid bone without much tone. If you use EMST and you improve that, perhaps the oral appliance is going to work better. The same thing's true with CPAP. When you use CPAP, air pressure holds the airway open. So you're no longer relying on the neuromuscular activation. You're relying on external pressure to hold it open. So you tend to not have the regular activity that you normally would have. EMST supports that so that you develop the reflex. It improves your neuromuscular system, and that CPAP is, in a sense, replacing. So it's very important to include that as a component.
Yeah. And by doing that, you're not having that big sympathetic that you saw on my graph multiple times throughout the night. But
yeah, well, here's the thing. The sympathetic nervous system gets active for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, just sitting here doing a podcast, your nervous system has been activated sympathetically because you're doing a podcast. After the podcast, it changes. So any kind of performance requires sympathetic activation. It's just something that we're really good at. And this is something that athletes are really good at. They're good at activating their sympathetic nervous system, but the best athletes are really good at activating their parasympathetic nervous system.
Yeah.
That's focus. That's vision. That's the ability to control your respiratory rate. PGA golfers that walk up to the 18th green with this 8.5-foot putt to win the green jacket have to be able to reduce their heart rate. You don't want 120 beats a minute trying to hit that ball. You want to be down in the 80s. You want to be down where it's a little elevated, so your attention's there, but you've controlled that. In fact, that's one of the things that our director of behavioral sleep medicine, Jay Wiles, works with a lot of PGA athletes, and he teaches heart rate variability biofeedback, something we use with all of our absolute rest clients that have heightened arousal responses like you. That's something that you train, just like EMST is training expiratory neuromuscular control. Heart rate variability biofeedback is training vagal nerve innervation to reduce sympathetic tone.
Yeah.
And it's just, if you do it regularly, it's like EMST. You're just training the reflex so that if you need it, like walking up the 18th green, you can use the breathing technique you've learned, and you're all of a sudden getting into this other realm of an ability to concentrate and to focus, but without the heightened activity. You don't need a heart rate of 120 to hit a golf ball. It doesn't help.
Right. Doesn't help.
Yeah.
Well, I want to get a little bit into, first off, I appreciate your time. I don't want to keep you too long, but I do want to talk a little bit about the diagnostics. I want to talk about the wearables, and I do want to visit into the absolute rest piece where you have the, talk about the cardiopulmonary coupling and some of that thing about, where wearables are going is it's pretty exciting to me, but yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's actually, I've been in the technology realm of sleep healthcare since 2005-06, when I helped start a company that's now called Knox Medical and Knox Health. It's one of the world's largest home sleep testing device companies, FDA cleared devices in the world, in Reykjavik, Iceland, and also Atlanta, Georgia, where we started it. And having been the chief medical officer of that company and developing all these devices in the FDA cleared realm, it was really clear at a certain point that all of a sudden, like the Aura rings, which were friends of ours from Finland, actually, who came out of the sleep world, that all of a sudden Aura became a consumer electronic that did pretty good sleep-based algorithmic development. And then others started coming into the fray with Fitbit going from a wearable on your belt to a wearable on your wrist. And then it started to looking at sleep. But again, more from the actigraphic perspective than using things like PPG analysis or photoplasmography, which looks at pulse. And that's how we use things like the cardiopulmonary coupling algorithm to detect autonomic function during the night. So it was clear to me that there was a convergence happening from the perspective of the FDA cleared devices and consumer electronics. And now you're starting to see that actually in real life. It's not just a blurred line, is I think a slowly but surely going to become one area of technology development. There are companies out there in the consumer electronic space that are going for FDA approval for their devices, for their bed devices, for their rings, for their watches, for their shirts that record sleep, all kinds of things. From the perspective that I can just go out and buy it and I can wear it, and it's as good as an FDA cleared device. Now, that's not been true for a lot of the devices out there, like the Whoops and the Auras. And, we know all those companies and actually helped, in some instances, helped to develop some of those algorithms. But the things that really stands clear is that there hasn't been companies out there developing a device that could work both as a diagnostic tool and as a consumer electronic. And that only recently actually happened. There's a company called Happy that does that, Happy Sleep. And they have a ring that you can buy. And then if your doctor wants, they flip a switch and it becomes an FDA cleared medical device to diagnose sleep disordered breathing, follow your sleep, your insomnia. It really kind of changed the whole perspective. And a lot of companies are starting to go, we got to get into that world, because now somebody can buy it, but then they can get their insurance to pay for it if it becomes necessary to use it that way. So I think that's really where the world's going in technology. There's certainly going to be a need for polysomnographic testing, which is my old company, Knox, making devices for the laboratories that could then also go into the homes and be usable for sleep testing outside of the lab. But it's still going to be, that's very much driven by medical professionals. The vast majority of people who are sort of like, it's not the doctor will see you now, it's the patient will see you now.
Yeah.
That's being driven by consumer electronics. And I think that's slowly but surely going to become an overlap within that, even within the medical programs. I know many of the sleep medicine programs around the country and the physicians themselves seeing patients, almost all of them have stories about, hey, doc, I wear my Whoop. Here's my data.
Yeah.
What do you think of my Aura data? What do you think of my Apple Watch data? The doctor's like, I don't know what to think about this, because I'm not trained on things that are not FDA cleared. Plus, this is not really included yet. But now it's starting to merge. Now you're starting to see that data is important because it's longitudinal. And our spot testing with polysomnography or home sleep apnea testing is a single night or a couple of nights. That's not enough to look at the variation, and also not enough to manage. So that's why we use in the Absolute Rest program a ring device that actually is developed by Sleep Image, a company here in Denver. They use the original cardiopulmonary coupling algorithm developed at Harvard. They licensed it from Harvard and Dr. Thomas in his laboratory. And it gives us enough information as an FDA cleared device to diagnose sleep disordered breathing, follow sleep disordered breathing. But it also gives us a number of qualitative metrics that quantify sleep quality. One called the Sleep Quality Index, which has been validated in different populations, but even more so the components like sympathetic activation through fragmentation, cyclical variation in heart rate, which is that heart response to breathing and arousal. And then even things like periodicity, which appear with central breathing versus sleep disordered breathing versus obstructive sleep disordered breathing. And even maybe periodic leg movements that associate with periodic limb movements and RLS. So there's a lot of other things that can be learned from measuring autonomic nervous system response to sleep and as a process that predicts daytime function. So that on a longitudinal basis is really, I think, much more useful for the medical community, for the psychology community treating insomnia.
Sure.
When we do CBTI or ACT-I, these are both, for insomnia therapies.
Yeah. Having
objective endpoints that we're trying to actually affect are just as important as the subjective analysis that the patient is giving us on a day-to-day. And we use both of those in Absolute Rest program. So we do all that therapy, but then monitor it with this device across time. And we do polysomnography initially. We do serum testing. We do some genetic testing. We do a whole battery of psychological, behavioral, sleep-related inputs, trauma. We look at personality types because they all inform sleep, because sleep is a general behavior as well as a biological function. And that allows us to then profile the individual in terms of what issues are they coming up against psychologically, behaviorally, environmentally. We do environmental sensors, light sensors, all kinds of things. And then also, what's the effect on their physiology? Like we see people with lots of autonomic activation, sympathetic activation, also have a lot of inflammatory markers out of whack. You'll see, like I mentioned earlier in our discussion, IL-6 is elevated in a lot of our clients, CRP, SED rates. We'll see slight elevations in like hemoglobin A1C because glycosylated hemoglobin is in response to elevated glucose at night. There's another thing that we often see with people who have dysregulation. It gives us more targets. It gives us more things to follow. And then also to make associations for people. Because we've had people come in who have been told many different things about like thyroid disease. They've been told that they have fatigue syndromes and all of these other things when actually no one looked at their sleep. And lo and behold, they've got undiagnosed sleep apnea or restless leg syndrome, or they've got psychophysiologic insomnia because of stress-induced PTSD. Or a horrible event that is now still a problem. So you have to attack the underlying cause to actually have the long-term effect. That's why we take people off medications more often than we provide any medications. And we take people off supplements rather than give them something. I mean, if your magnesium levels are normal, don't take magnesium. If your vitamin D levels are normal, don't take vitamin D. I mean, same thing with testosterone. I get these guys who are high performers with testosterones of 1,000 or 1,500 or B12 levels over 2,000. Like, no wonder you can't sleep, guys. You're giving yourself arousal based stimulants. So we try to work with a lot of things.
You've alluded to this already. All wearables are not created equal. And this absolute rest one that you're talking about checks data points like every 100 milliseconds or something crazy like that.
It's 100 times a second. So 100 hertz sampling rate. That way we can apply the CPC analysis with fine detail. You look at Aura, you look at Whoop, all these other devices, even the Apple Watch, their sampling rate is like every 5 minutes they sample. So you're missing 4 minutes of what was happening. And so the averages across the night are probably reasonable, but the mins and maxes, the heart rate variability measures, those are all incredibly inaccurate. And just looking at stages. So one of the things we talked about earlier was polysomnographic testing. So PSG testing is the standard or the gold standard, but it's also the oldest tool in our toolbox in sleep in many ways. So it's useful for what it's useful. It's got a lot of data around it, has a lot of interest around the EEG components in particular for certain aspects of the science, but it's not very useful as a monitoring or management tool, largely because it's scored. When we get data from the eye movements, the EEG, the heart, breathing, oxygen, movement, all these channels, there's like 12 channels across the screen. Every 30 seconds, we have to apply rules, scoring rules that are, in a sense, somewhat arbitrary because humans made them up. They're based on as much information as we have from the science, but they're still arbitrary. And then we assign wake, REM, non-REM stage 1, 2, and 3. And so every 30 seconds, we have to call it something. And in that 30 seconds, 15 seconds or more looks like a stage. The whole thing is called that stage. So you could have 16 seconds of non-REM stage 1 and 14 seconds of REM. And the whole thing's called non-REM stage 1. So we're losing data, if you think about it from that perspective, because we're calling the whole thing 30 seconds a thing. When we look at parasympathetic and sympathetic activity through PPG analysis, it's just a continuous readout of your physiology. There's no scoring rule put into that. And I mean, for the apnea, there's scoring rules. But for the actual physiology, it's an algorithm that basically shows parasympathetic and sympathetic activity. Sleep stability is what we're really looking at with autonomic testing. It's far more sensitive than polysomnographic testing in the sense that small perturbations can be seen with significant activity in the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. The thing we miss with the autonomic testing is specificity. So it's sensitive, incredibly highly sensitive for subcortical arousal. But what caused that?
Mm-hmm.
We don't know. That's where we have to use metadata. So what's their age? What's their diet like? What other complaints are they having? What did they do that day? We have to contextualize these highly sensitive outputs with what potentially could be the problem, and then design an intervention that is specific to that individual so that we can actually help to push down the sympathetic surges, or treat the sleep-disordered breathing that's driving that issue, or treat the insomnia and preparation for sleep so that we get parasympathetic activity rather than a flurry of heart arrhythmias. It's a very different tool. So the idea of longitudinal analysis, I think, is really where we're all headed. And on devices like the sleep image device that we use, the Happy Ring, which is another one that people could use for the same thing, these are available for medical providers. It's just that they don't use them in the same way we do, because part of the problem is they're not financially incentivized.
Right.
And we're not financially incentivized either, by the way. We pay for each of those studies, but that's important because the ultimate goal here is change over time. I think that's going to slowly but surely going to change as our healthcare system starts to reward monitoring and management, like what's called remote patient monitoring or remote treatment management or chronic care management. Data itself is being collected by these devices, and it shows adequacy of therapeutic intervention. That's something that is now being paid for by Medicare, Medicaid, and likely, hopefully, private insurances in the future. Because what happens in CMS tends to filter
bleed
into
over
the rest of us. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you a few more questions. I know we're kind of running late, but then just wrap things up. But I and you've kind of already alluded to a lot of this stuff. But like the sleep latency onset, we talked about that a little bit. It kind of goes into getting in the parasympathetic stage and all those things you do prior. One thing that I notice a lot of people, and I'm sure you do too, is the middle of the night wakefulness. And one of the things I was talking to Absolute Rest guys is kind of, I've got methods that I do in the middle of the night when my brain wakes up and is chewing on things. And it seems like a lot of people, especially in our age range, kind of have this activity.
Yeah.
But kind of like what you're saying is getting comfortable with that, not getting aggravated like, oh, my life's going to suck tomorrow. I'm not going to be able to perform. Then you go down this rabbit hole of nonsense, and just getting comfortable with, either this isn't a big deal and I'm going to be okay, or do some breathing exercises and kind of bring yourself back. But
everybody has maintenance insomnia. It's the most common form of insomnia. Actually, most people think of insomnia as I can't fall asleep, but actually it's can't get back to sleep is the most common issue. And that has so many different underlying potential causes that you have to unfold all of those things before you can actually say what to do. I have people who have like REM-related sleep-disordered breathing. They wake up at 3:00 in the morning like clockwork because they go into REM and their breathing causes them to wake up. Right. So we've got to treat that REM-related sleep-disordered breathing a little bit more assiduously to get rid of that arousal. There are others that wake up after their deep non-REM sleep because they actually perceive their sleep as lighter. And there are things called sleep state misperception syndrome, which tends to occur actually often with REM, creating wakefulness in parts of the brain, because the brain doesn't sleep all at one time. Parts of the brain sleep at a time. And so you can get wakefulness or alertness coming out of REM that makes you think you didn't sleep at all. Then there's populations that basically are going through like an issue at the moment, like anxiety at the moment. And those are temporary. Those are not long-term issues, but it occurs to some people a couple of days in a row. That's where learning the acceptance and commitment therapy approach is so important because it's expected. This is going to happen to everybody. It's going to happen to me. And when it does, become comfortable with the understanding that at least I'm resting. And then also know that there are things I can do that, will help me get back to sleep. But if I don't sleep, it's okay. I'll be all right. This is not an everyday occurrence. Even if it is an everyday occurrence, I'm working on how to accept this and also how to improve it, because that's my value is I want to sleep and be healthy. Using those value systems as a trigger. And breathing is one of the things that we typically use, because breathing is a physical act that actually helps to shut down sympathetic nervous system. So that's something we can use. For others, it can be a cognitive approach. So actually using your mind to create imagery. that actually helps you to get into that state of relaxation. And for some people, that's awful. The last thing they want to do is try to meditate. It makes it worse. So that's why a physical active breathing can be more effective for that population.
Yeah.
But more importantly, it's really essential that they not do things that will keep them awake.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden in the middle of the night, don't turn on all the lights. Go into another room. Get bored. Sit in the middle of the room in darkness.
Yeah.
Do your breathing there. Get yourself tired. When you start yawning, go back to bed.
Yeah.
And that's the underlying concept. It's called stimulus control.
Mm-hmm.
It comes from CBTI. The idea that you control the stimulus, which is your bed and bedroom, rather than it controlling you. And
just
avoiding, it's a quick cognitive switch.
Yeah, I like how you said avoiding novelty is the key, really. And then, I've heard you say before, your sleep sanctuary. I kind of dig that. Mm-hmm. I think that's kind of cool. So
I don't use the word bedroom anymore. I haven't for decades. I tell people that the bedroom is the place the bed's in.
Yeah.
It's not a room for the bed. It's a room for your sleep.
Right.
So take anything else out of that room that is not about sleep.
Yeah.
Televisions, lights. I'm also a proponent for smaller bedrooms that are not huge, expansive places where you have sitting areas and a television and a makeup.
Yeah.
Keep your sleep space small, comfortable, dark, cool, and quiet.
Yeah.
If you can do those things, it's a boring location. You can make it beautiful, but make it boring.
Yeah.
Don't make it active. It's not an active. I mean, you're there for 8 hours. Comfort's the most important part. That has to do with the environment and the bedding and all the other things. So we work with bedding companies, for instance. Invest in that. If you're going to invest in that, it's better than investing in a car. You use it every single day. Yeah. You might not use your car every day, but you will use your bed every day. Yeah. So think of it as an investment in you. Yeah.
Man, Jeff, I really appreciate the time. I could just sit here and talk for another few hours, man, but I really appreciate your time. I really do. Is there anything else you want to leave us with, or big point?
Hey, I think that anybody who wants to improve their sleep, look at your sleep as a part of your day-to-day programming for yourself. If you're trying to live a longer, healthier life, there isn't an area that you could do more in to make a bigger effect than sleep. You can do as much as you want in the exercise realm, your nutrition realm, but if your sleep is off, it's going to throw off both of those. It's sort of the pillar underneath those as well. So I look at it this way. If your sleep is good, your nutrition is your next layer. And if your nutrition's good, exercise is your next layer. And think of it as in those layers, that even if you don't sleep really well, at least eat well.
Yeah.
And try to get a little exercise in. But if you didn't exercise and you didn't eat well, if you slept well, you created a good foundation for making those changes. So always consider sleep as sort of the bedrock on which you're creating your lifestyle. Mm-hmm. If your lifestyle is based on maintaining a good, healthy sleep component, you've reduced all kinds of risk factors for longevity problems and also for performance issues.
Well said. You've thrown a lot of great wisdom and information, man. I really appreciate it very much. I'll be going back and listening to this. I've been like throwing down notes the whole time. So this has been great just for me. So, man,
awesome.
I really appreciate it and hope to see you again and talk more in the future.
Yeah.
Again. All right.
Yeah. Anytime you want to talk sleep, I'm here for the conversation.
Okay.
So appreciate it. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thanks, Jeff. See you later.
Thanks for listening. You can follow us on Apple and Spotify, and please review us to let us know what you think. Thanks.